Uzumaki is a horror manga created by Junji Ito. Published between 1998 and 1999, the story uses the lens of Kiri to tell the tale of Kurozucho, a Japanese coastal town that has become infected with spirals. It's a pretty legendary series in the realms of Japanese horror, and for good reason. It's probably Junji Ito's masterpiece, his absolute best work. Not that there isn't tough competition, but it's such a singular and interesting and incredibly distressing story that I think really resonated with a lot of people. I'm not going to go into the entire story, but I am going to spoil the entire ending, so just beware. At a certain point in the story, Kiri and her family and her boyfriend are all left homeless. In fact, most of the town of Kurozucho is destroyed by tornadoes and hurricanes. The only buildings left standing are the incredibly old row houses, which somehow managed to withstand the weather. Eventually, everyone in Kurozucho has to move into these limited row houses, and there is just not enough room. So they begin to expand these houses. Kiri eventually decides, with a small group of others, to try and escape Kurozucho. By the time they come back, all of the row houses have been completely built, and they form a giant spiral in the middle of the town. This seemed impossible. They were only away for hours, maybe days at most, but these buildings are almost nearly complete. It's something that would have taken weeks to finish, and yet here they are, nearly done, and they were only away for a few hours. Turns out that it's very possible that they were stuck within a time spiral, a concept that isn't really explored in the book, but all that you really need to know is they've kind of travelled into the future. Sort of. It's a bit more complicated than that, but it doesn't matter. It's soon revealed that the entire town has been cursed for its entire history, probably. These old row houses that have now been expanded into this giant spiral were originally part of a previous spiral that was completely toppled and buried. The origins of the spirals that have infected the town are murky. They're totally unknown. It's a very Lovecraftian story, which makes sense considering Junji Ito has been compared to Lovecraft for essentially his entire career. All that we know for definite is that the town of Kurozucho as we know it will become rubble. It will be buried underneath towns upon towns, and, well, eventually, in the future, everything will be so forgotten. Eventually, the future will be an empty desert. So now let's talk about something completely different. The Stanley Parable is a 2012 Half-Life 2 mod turned 2013 standalone video game. Its premise is very interesting and leads to some impeccable comedy. Essentially, a man named Stanley wakes up in his office to find that all of his co-workers have disappeared. He also hears the voice of a narrator in his head that is describing the story to him. This game, I mean, I feel like if you've been on the internet and have been involved in the gaming community on the internet at any point over the past 10 years, you probably know about the Stanley Parable already. The comedy is very apparent from the moment you face your first choice in the game. You reach a room, you are given two doors, and the narrator tells us that Stanley goes into the door on his left. You can choose to follow that order, or you can go through the right door. You can fuck up the narrator's story. It's very funny to watch his reactions.
Stanley was so bad at following directions, it's incredible he wasn't fired years ago.
The Stanley Parable has been talked about at great length since its release. It's been over 10 years since the standalone version came out. Just last year, we got the Ultra Deluxe version, a remake, remaster, port, sequel, expansion, reimagining? It's kind of hard to pin down, but it's definitely the best version of the game. Not only does it have the entire original game within it, it packs in so much new content that reflects on the past 10 years that I think it's definitely the definitive version of the game, and I don't really understand how anyone could disagree with that. However, a lot of people talk about Stanley Parable as a comedy, but nobody really looks at the emotional elements within it. I say that, but one of the most famous and popular endings is one in which it was revealed that Stanley was having a nervous breakdown and collapsed and died in the middle of the street. It's a bit much sometimes. Ultra Deluxe added a whole swath of new content, such as a jump circle, and nothing else. This new content was so disappointing that even the narrator reflects upon this and decides he's going to do something about it. He introduces the player to a new area called the Memory Zone. This is a little cottage that is just filled with memorabilia from when the Stanley Parable was originally released. We get a look at some positive reviews. It's very cozy. It's a very nice area. Eventually, though, you can enter the maintenance area of the Memory Zone, and here's where we find the Steam reviews for the game. Just bear with me, please. This is where we see some of the more negative reviews for the game, which really upset the narrator. One of the reviews bemoans the long-winded monologues that the narrator often gives off, and wishes for a skip button, which the narrator complies with. You're led into a small room, and all that's within it is a button that skips through the narrator's dialogue. Well, it's a bit more than that. It doesn't just skip through the narrator's dialogue. Whenever you press that button, you black out, and then you come back whenever the narrator has finished his dialogue. The first time this happens, you're only gone for less than a minute, but the more times you press this button, the longer you black out. This eventually begins to worry the narrator. The door in the room disappears, there's no way out anymore. All you can do is press the skip button, and each time you press it, you disappear for longer and longer. Eventually the narrator stops talking. We don't know what happens to him. Press the button again. There's now a hole in the ceiling. Parts of this building are crumbling down. Press it again. Now there's plant life growing from these crumbled areas within the building. It's kind of nice. It's pretty. You press it again and now it's pitch black and there are strange noises coming from outside of the building. It's kind of creepy, kind of scary. Eventually, you can't press the button anymore. It's broken. It's buried underneath rubble. You've been blacked out for so long that the entire building is now sunk into sand, and you can walk out of a hole in one of the walls. When you walk out, it's just a giant expanse of nothing. It's a desert. An empty desert. A desert completely empty of anything except you and the building that you've just walked out of, which is already being buried underneath piles upon piles of nothing. You don't spend long in this desert. You're eventually pulled out and are eventually put back to the start of the game, which is how the game functions. It's tiny little loops of gameplay that can sprawl out. This desert spoke to me? I don't know what it is. Thinking about how far in the future you have to be for the whole world to just be an empty desert. You do eventually return to this area in the game. After you do all of the new content that the narrator eventually invents, such as useless collectibles that give you nothing, an infinite hole, and other such things, including a bucket, who is my best friend. I love the bucket. You can eventually find another ending in which the narrator brings you back to the memory zone for you to collect more figurines. Eventually, the narrator seems to have a sort of mental breakdown that honestly gives one of the best endings in the game in my opinion, but I'm not really going to spoil that. All that's really important to know is that after you get this ending, you unlock something new on the title screen. You get the Epilogue. The Epilogue is a joke from earlier in the game in which the narrator, when talking about new content for the Stanley Parable 2, mentions an epilogue, but he never really has the idea of what the epilogue is pinned down. Well, that's what this is. That's what the epilogue is. When you click into the epilogue, you're brought back into the desert. There are multiple jump cuts. These, I think, signify time passing. I think what's happening is that you, the player, as Stanley, are travelling this desert trying to find something. It's kind of beautiful. You go from the desert during the day to a nice campfire at night, a frightening sandstorm that whips around you, and a beautiful sunset. And this is all put against some absolutely fantastic music. I'm gonna find out who the composer was and put their name up on the screen. Eventually, you find something. You see the gateway to the memory zone. It's completely crumbled. There's no more beautiful shining light coming through it. It's just standing in the sand. And, in the background, sunken into the sand, much like the building that the skip button was housed within, you see the memory zone. Entering it, you see it's been redone up for the Stanley Parable 2, as if the narrator, or whoever has been taking care of this building up until the end of civilization, was now nostalgic for that game's release. Which, I feel like I should have mentioned, the Stanley Parable 2 is not a real game, it's just an in-joke within the Ultra Deluxe. Rather than seeing positive reviews about the game and reminiscing on the past, what we get is a series of negative reviews, and a story about the developers of the Stanley Parable 2 sort of giving up on creating a franchise out of the Stanley Parable. I don't know if this is supposed to be a criticism of people just tearing into new games that do new things without actually taking into account how much time and passion people put into these projects, or if it's meant to be a criticism of needless franchising, turning things into long-winded series that don't need to be long-winded series, or if it's a criticism of both. It is kind of sad though. But, again, we're in a nowhere land, we're in an empty desert, the world is dead. There's no one to remember this story, there's no one to remember these reviews other than you. Eventually, you fall into an office and there is a computer, and on this computer you have a conversation with an entity that you've been conversing with for the whole game. For the first 5 times that you booted up the game, you're given a prompt to set the correct time. If you actually set the time, you eventually enter into conversation with something. The text on the screen. This text is probably my favourite character in this version of the game. I like the narrator, but you're kind of supposed to butt heads with him at points, whereas with this guy, this thing, you're kind of just having a nice friendly conversation about settings and time. It's fun. He eventually goes away because he has no more data to gather on you. It's kind of sad seeing him go, but once you eventually unlock this epilogue and you find him here, it's kind of sweet. He's been down here this whole time just waiting for you. During this conversation, he bemoans the death of the Stanley Parable franchise, and he decides that it's not the end. He's gonna keep making Stanley Parable sequels, and you're gonna help him. Every time you boot the game, it's gonna have a new title screen, with the number next to the title being larger than the last, and you get to pick the subtitle. It's pretty cool. It's a nice little mechanic that you can find. I think this is definitely a critique of needless sequels. The entity says he's not going to bother changing any of the contents of the game, he's just going to give it a new number and a new subtitle, and that's good enough. Making new content is too much work. Huh? Making new things is too much work. In Stanley Parable, the future is an empty desert. It's beautiful, it's terrifying, and it's inevitable. In Uzumaki Kuruzo Cho, the future is a spiral that crumbles to rubble. Civilization's lost completely. I get kind of existential from time to time, you know, I think about death. it is something I think about. And I don't know if this epilogue is supposed to be emotionally affecting, or if it's just a setting for a joke about sequels. But I really, really love this epilogue. A lot of my favourite moments in gaming are completely non-scripted, or at least are not intended by the developers. Like, in Breath of the Wild, wow, 2 videos in a row where I've talked about Breath of the Wild. In Breath of the Wild, I did all the towers as my very first personal mission, and it just so happened that the last one I did is also the one where Cass, the bird, is playing a song. It felt like a reward for doing all of these towers, for spending hours playing this game and unlocking the entire map. I thought this was intentional, that whatever the last tower you went up would be the one that Cass was on, but no. He's always only on that one tower. It just so happened that that was the last tower I went to. That was a completely unintentional moment from the developers that still resonated with me incredibly hard. This epilogue is a scripted moment. It's a very linear, single, short level. I think I got through it in like 6 minutes. But I think it's one of my favourite moments in gaming. It's sort of a closed book, not just to the world of the Stanley Parable, but my own existential feelings towards the future of humanity. I feel like at some point, yeah, all that's going to be left on Earth is just nothing. Just sand and dirt that's burying a bunch of art and beauty and memories, and that's okay. It's inevitable, and that's okay. Wow, this video, what the fuck? Why did I just spend, okay, I've spent 20 minutes, at least according to Audacity, talking about the Stanley Parable and how its epilogue is an emotionally affecting piece of existential media. Jesus Christ, I need to get medicated. Bye-bye.